Major funding for these broadcasts is made possible by grants from New York Community Bank, Capital One Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Chase Commercial Term Lending, M&T Bank, Customers Bank, Genova Burns, Witkoff, Greenberg Traurig. Additional support is provided by AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, AVR Realty Company, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Citizens Bank, Collins Building Services, CPEX Real Estate Services, Cushman & Wakefield, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, Levine Builders, Fisher Brothers, First Nationwide Title Agency, Flushing Bank, Foley and Lardner, Friedman, Handler Real Estate Organization, HAP Investments, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Madison Realty Capital, Matone Group, Mercantile Commerce Bank, Meridian Capital Group, MHP Real Estate Services, New Banks, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rosewood Realty Group, SJP Properties, Sterling National Bank, Sterling Risk, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, The Continuum Company, The Moynihan Group, and These Friends.
Culinary Institute? Oh, come on. That's not me. Going to open up a restaurant? Tough times. Made some money in the restaurant business, lost some money. Let me open up more restaurants. There's a place called the Hamptons. Maybe there's an opportunity. Nah, you know what? I'm going to be on TV. I'm going to have a weekly radio show. I'm going to write a book. I'm going to be the leading restaurateur and chef on Long Island. And I have him, Tom Schaudel. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So tell me about your grandparents, who we have some pictures, how they came over here.
Well, my maternal grandparents came over from England. They came from the Liverpool area, a little town called Wigan, which is right, it's just south of that. And they came through Detroit, emigrated through Detroit.
Through Detroit?
Yeah, and wound up in Flushing. And my father's parents, my father's father was born in Switzerland, and his mother was born here, and her family came from, I think, the Alsace. I don't know. I'm really not clear on it. It was a German or French side. I'm not really.
Is that because you went into the wine business, which I also?
Yeah, exactly.
You figured, that was. I forgot that you were also you make your own wines,
That's
right?
Good pedigree there,
Right.
And my parents met in Flushing in high school, and that's how it all started.
Then you told me that they got married, and your dad was in the Navy.
He was in the Navy. He was on the USS Conway, a destroyer in Korea, and I don't think I met him until I was about 2. He was still over there, and he came home.
But you were born on a naval base. You were born in St. Albans?
St. Albans Naval Hospital, yeah.
Naval Hospital in Queens, in Jamaica.
Yeah.
And then, so your father finishes the Navy, and then he gets a job with the police force, you said.
He started as he went on the police force. He was stationed in the 108 precinct in Queens, in I guess Astoria area, whatever, College Point. I'm not really sure. And then I guess about 7 or 8 years later, he didn't like it so much.
Yeah, you were saying it was the period of the napkin issue.
Yeah, there was a lot of corruption.
He
was. He told me later on he was uncomfortable with all of it, what was going on, and just didn't like the job. And wound up switching over to the fire department, which you could do back then. I guess you still can, I don't know. And then wound up retiring from the fire department.
So you grew up originally in Flushing.
Right.
And then you said to me that with the help of your grandparents, you moved out to the country.
Yes.
Carl Place, Long Island. Farms, right?
Oh, yeah. There was a dairy farm down the block on Old Country Road, which is inconceivable now if you know the area. It looks like, Queens Boulevard. It's pretty well traveled and built up. But at the time, it was kind of rural. I mean, there was a big open lot next to our house with woods, and, we used to, it was like Huck Finn, you go into the woods and you come out for dinner, and you go back in, and, hunting snakes and sleigh riding and all the stuff that you do. You know, there's cliffs there. It was kind of open field, you know.
So when you were growing up, you said you had some newspaper out, you had some delivery work, but you liked guitars, right?
Yeah, it was the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. You know, when I saw that, it flipped a switch in me, you know, and I wanted to take guitar lessons. And my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, my dad's father, bought me a guitar and used to send me $3 a week for lessons in the mail, you know. And so that's how it all started, you know, and I've been playing since I'm 12.
So, but what happens later on? You bust the guitars?
No, what happened?
Or the amplifiers?
The amplifier, yeah. What happened was, you know, I was playing Beatles songs like everybody was back then, and music was fairly simple. Rock and roll was kind of straightforward. And then this guy named Jimi Hendrix came along and turned the entire genre on its ear. And I was saying to myself, oh, now what? I got to learn this stuff is hard, you know. And there was also tonal things that he was doing with amplifiers that nobody had done before. So I was trying to get that Foxy Lady tone. I had this like $40 Silvertone amp, which wasn't happening. So I was trying to modify it. I cut the speakers with a razor. I did all kinds of stuff. I kept blowing it up, you know. And so finally my father said, I'm not giving you any more money for this. You want to fix your amp, go out and get a job. And so at 15, I lied my way into a dishwasher's job because he needed working papers. I didn't have them.
You started as a dishwasher at 15. You met Shorty, the line chef.
Shorty the cook, yeah. Shorty was African-American man, about 5'3", and he was built like Joe Frazier. He was a very muscular guy. And I don't think he had much of an education. In fact, I know he didn't. But he was savant-like with what he could do with the orders. We never used a dupe or a ticket. Nobody ever wrote anything down. And we used to do 600 or 700 dinners on a Saturday night, and they would come in and call them out. I need 3 medium rare, 4 rare, 1 well, 2 lobster tails, a surf and turf, and a flounder. And somehow, I don't know how he did it, but somehow he could organize all that in his head and pull it off.
The owner of the place also was a mentor of yours, right?
Sid Solomon, yeah. Sid kind of taught me what the restaurant business could be like, you know, from the standpoint of the owner. You know, I watched him all the time. He kind of took me under his wing for about 2 years. And, you know, he brought me in the front. He made me a host for a while. He tried to make me a waiter. I wasn't, you know, I don't have the patience for that. But he was trying. He was a real good guy, Sid. And his son, Steve, who was, I guess, about 30 at the time, was doing the same. You know, he'd help me out in the front and show me what to do. He made me a busboy for a while. So I got a kind of a good idea of what was going on.
But you're still playing the guitar with your buddies,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, still playing guitar, yeah.
And you weren't, as you said to me, you were not the best student.
No, it was terrible.
Okay, you were not the best student. You also like favoring the motorcycles.
Yeah.
And then you go to the guidance counselor. What happens with the guidance counselor in your senior year?
Well, it was a man named Artie Smullion, who we're friends to this day. He's still around, and you know, we got to know each other pretty well because I wasn't really doing well in school, so I was sent down for a lot of guidance, and so I was talking to him one day.
Isn't that called detention?
I think so, yeah. So anyway, I was sitting there talking to him. He says, have you decided what to do after school? I said, no. He says, well, why don't you study mortuary science? So I said, well, why would I do that? He goes, well, you wear black a lot, you know. And I'm like, why don't I just study to be a guidance counselor? Because it doesn't seem all that difficult if this is all it takes, you know. So we were laughing about that. And I kind of let him know. I said, you know, I've been working in this restaurant for a couple of years. And at that point, I had almost taken over the kitchen because Shorty was a disaster. He was always drunk, you know. And I said, you know, I kind of like this cooking thing. It's, you know, sort of like music. I mean, you have an audience, you have an art form, you have a way to express yourself, you have an occasional groupie, you have people to follow you around and applause after dinner. It's kind of a parallel experience. So he says, well, did you ever consider going to a chef school? And I said, I didn't know they had them, you know. And so he talked to me about, you know, CIA was really the only one back then.
And at that time, it was in New Haven, Connecticut.
Still in New Haven, yeah. So I applied, and lo and behold, got accepted and went first year in New Haven, and the college changed campuses in '72, and I finished my second year in Hyde Park.
What you do during the summers? Went back to
I just went back to work. You know,
at the Sirloin.
No, I left by that point. I went to a place called Tudor Times where I met my friend Sandy, who became a mentor also. You know.
So you graduate 73, and as you said, for the next 10 years, you basically were involved with some of the country club scenes. You worked in the kitchens at different places. So what happens in 83? How do you become an entrepreneur?
Well, I had been talking about opening up my own place like every other, you know, young cook does. You know, you have these aspirations, and I was, you know, it was mostly bar talk, you know, and I had a friend of mine who was a bartender about my age, about 2 years older than me, Marty Smith, his name is, and you know, I used to tell him all the time, I want to open this, I'm going to open that. So finally he said, why don't you just shut up and do it? I'm tired of hearing it, you know. And so it just so happened that a guy that I had worked with became a restaurant broker. He had owned a restaurant for a while and got out of the business, became a broker. And he came to me and he said, look, I have this location. I'm interested in doing something. Do you want to do it with me? And I said, yeah, let me take a look. So I took a look, and the two of us didn't have enough money. So I involved Marty and Sandy, my other two friends, and the four of us got together. And we opened Panama Hatties.
Now, you told me the reason it was Panama Hatties was you were in Florida with the hats?
No, what happened was when we were trying to assemble a list of names, you write them down as you dislike them, you cross them off or whatever.
Or you do like Smith and Walensky, open up the telephone.
Yeah, exactly. So Panama Hatties always made the cut for some reason, and that was the era where there was Apollonis, there was that kind of naming going on, and so a friend of mine had suggested it to me, and so a couple of days before we were supposed to open, I went down to his condo in Florida to take a little R&R. And lo and behold, I look out from the deck and I see this place, Panama Hatties, and I said I should have known because he's never had an original idea in his life, And so it turned out that we ripped the name off. I mean, unbeknownst to me, but we did. And I guess they didn't have any national trademark on it because there was never any.
So how did the restaurant do when you first opened?
Oh, Panama Hatties was great. I mean, we took off like a rocket. It was very busy.
What do you attribute it to? Was it the good chef, or the location, or the name?
I think it was. I think all of it. We were doing a pretty good job in the kitchen. I was still young then, and had some ideas, but not quite as accomplished as I probably should have been when I went into my first restaurant. But it was more courage than intelligence.
Now you're in Panama Hatties, '83, and then '87. What happens? Somebody comes to you and makes you an offer that you couldn't refuse. Like The Godfather.
It was kind of like that. I got a call from a friend of mine who was a broker, and he said, "I have a guy who wants to buy your place." And I said, "Well, I didn't know it was for sale." He said, "Well, everything's for sale. Come up with a number." So I came up with a ridiculous number and didn't think anything of it. And 2 days later, he called me back. He says, "The guy accepted your number." And I'm like, "What?" He says, "Yeah, the guy said he's going to do it." And I felt guilty because it wasn't really worth that. So I said, "Well, tell him to knock me down, whatever number it was." And so he did. He talked to the guy, and the guy came back. He says, "Well, this is my final offer, and I'm not 1 cent over that." And I'm like, "Okay, you're a good negotiator. That's fine with me." And then I called Marty and Sandy. I said, "I think I sold the restaurant." They go, "What are you talking about?" So I told them what I sold it for, and they were like, "Okay," and that's how it happened. It was literally, it happened in 3 days.
So it's 1987. You have a couple of bucks in your pocket,
right?
And then the next 4 years are a little difficult. What happened to the level that you were homeless? You said to me, right?
I was, yeah. What happened was the Hamptons and the stock market crash all at the same time. We had taken the money and bought a place in East Hampton that I always wanted to be out there. I love East Hampton.
So when did you open up the place in East Hampton?
87.
Oh, so you utilized it right in the appropriate time with the stock market.
Totally.
And what was the name of that place?
It was called the Spring Close House. And, it was what it was. I mean, we opened up. It was a pretty good season, and the stock market crash happened, and the Hamptons just went away for about 3 or 4 years. There were fire selling houses. It was just a mess out there. It was a mess everywhere, but, especially out there. The first thing to go was the vacation home and whatever. So that was a tough couple of years. And we tried, it was funny. I had a guy come to me after the first year and said, "Listen, I think we had about $175,000, $180,000 in the place or whatever it was." And the guy came to me and he said, "Listen, I'll buy this thing right now for $175,000. But I'm so smart that I know how to fix this, and I'm so talented that I can figure this out, and so my smarts and my talent got me into a $350,000 problem. I probably should have just sold it at the time, but ego's involved and all this other stuff, and I kind of hung on.
So you said to me, literally, you were nearly homeless.
Oh, I was living upstairs, and they shut my electric off. We shut the restaurant down. I was living in an apartment upstairs, and I didn't have enough money to pay the electric bill, so they shut it off. And I could only get incoming calls. I couldn't make a phone call out. That was 1991.
So what happens in 1991? You get an opportunity knocks?
Yeah, I got another phone call from a guy I knew who was a partner of a friend of mine who I knew to be a mover and shaker, and he did a lot of development in Montauk. He was a dentist by trade, but he developed a lot of property on Montauk, hotels and such, condos. And he was always doing something. He's a very energetic guy and a fairly well-capitalized guy. And so he called me up and he said, I've heard about you. I've tasted your food. I like what you do. I'm opening this restaurant in Montauk. and I'd like you to come and take a look at it, see if you want to work with me. So I got excited because I knew of his reputation. At the same time, I was offered a job up the island that was paying fairly well for the time, $125,000 a year or whatever it was.
And you were homeless, unemployed, and you could use the job.
Yeah. And my daughter was 5 years old, and my girlfriend was up the island at the time. They were all living in Westbury. And this job was in Port Washington. And so I went out and I talked to Mike, and I decided to do $1,000 a week for 15 weeks in the season.
Now, your father said, what?
Well, that's what he said. He went, what? He goes, let me understand this. You have a job offer here that's paying that. This is where your daughter is. This is where your girlfriend is. And you're going to Montauk, 15 minutes east of where you got your rear end kicked, for $1,000 a week. Yeah. You're out of your mind. Perhaps. And I didn't know. I could have been, but I just had a feeling. And so what happened was we had a pretty good season, and Mike said to me, well, what are you going to do? I got to close it for the winter. I said, well, I can't sit around all winter and do nothing. I have all these bills I got to pay. I got $1 million in debt. He goes, well, I'll pay you all year. I'll pay you for the year, and I'll give you $15,000, and I want you to just go fly around the country and come back with some ideas. And next year I'll make you my partner. And I went, really? He went, yeah. And that's what happened. And we subsequently opened up, I think, 4 or 5 restaurants together after that.
Mike, who was the dentist, who's the real estate operator, who was the restaurateur, also thought he knew everything about running a restaurant.
Yeah. Mike is nothing if not energetic and confident, and he's a hoot to be around. He's a fabulous guy to be around. So we were doing this restaurant together. It was called Eli's Roadhouse. It was a barbecue place, and I was trying to keep him out of the way because he was kind of getting in the way. Usually I would build the restaurants, and he would stay out of the way and just fund them and come and eat. And he said to me one day, he goes, we were having this argument, and I said, you're getting in the way here. You're costing me time and money and effort and all that. And he goes, you don't understand how much I know about restaurants. So I said, well, why don't you educate me and tell me? So he goes, well, I've eaten in every important restaurant in the United States and Europe 10 times, this, that, and the other thing. I said, well, I've flown to every one of those cities. I never landed the plane. There's a big difference between eating in a restaurant and running a restaurant, And what happened was, I think he got that lesson because we had Eli's open for about maybe 3 or 4 months. I couldn't take it anymore. I said, I'm going back to Montauk. Thank God we're opening for the season. Here, it's yours. You do it. You're such a smart guy. And he just got frustrated, fed up, and sold it, within 3 months,
So then what happened? Because you opened up Soulfish and a couple of other...
Coolfish, yeah.
Coolfish.
Yeah, we opened up 107 Forest Avenue first, which was in Locust Valley, because I needed something to do for the winter. Montauk wasn't sustaining itself over the winter. So, I was going to Mexico for 6 weeks, and it's a lot of fun, but, you just wind up spending everything you make, So we opened up the place up in Locust Valley, and that was wildly successful. We had a real good review, a couple of them actually. And the place grew to the point where we ran out of room. And as I was contemplating what to do, should I expand into the next building, move it, I got a call from Mitchell Reckler, who was one of the principals of Rexon, which is one of the largest commercial real estate people in New York. And he was a customer of mine. He says, Tom, I got this location in Syosset. Why don't you take a look? So I said, Mitchell, really, I can't. I got too much stuff going on. Employees are driving me crazy. I don't want another restaurant. You really should take a look. I went, no. He kept calling. So looking's what I do. I went down there and I took a look, and it was a wreck. The place had been abandoned or whatever. So I said, I can't do this. I don't have the energy or the money for this. Well, what if I do that and the other thing, and maybe I'll put the air conditioning in, and maybe I can do a new roof for you, and maybe I can contribute this, that. I kept saying no, not realizing I was negotiating, the whole time. And so finally, the deal got so good, I said, well, if I say no one more time, he's going to say, well, hell with it, and give it to somebody else. So we said yes, and we wound up moving 107 to the Coolfish location. I couldn't call it 107 because that was the address of the place. And we were right by 106 and 107. It would have been too confusing, so we just gave it a new name, Coolfish. And we actually, Gennady called it the premier seafood house between the bridge and Montauk.
Was that Newsday's review?
Yeah.
When did you open up the sushi restaurant?
Well, the first Japanese restaurant I opened up was at the same time that I had Coolfish. It was called Lemongrass, and that was in Roslyn. And it was kind of like an Asian fusion thing, when everybody was doing that. I got on that train too, But I had, I studied Kung Fu for a long time, so I was always in that Asian headset. I was around it all the time, Chinatown, Japantown, and I understood the flavors. I wanted to, do that. And we had that for about 5 or 6 years. I wound up selling that. And then the sushi place itself, the one that I have now, we opened up about 2 years ago.
So when did you get back to the South Fork and the North Fork and the Hamptons. When did you?
Well,
you went over there. You were involved with West Hampton and a couple of other places.
Yeah, I had a friend of mine who had that location where Dundeck was in West Hampton. He wanted to do something with it, so I moved a restaurant I had called Passion Fish from here to there. It turned out that they had sold the building. You know, he signed a kind of a sketchy lease. I didn't really know what he was doing with the lease because it wasn't really my thing. I was just kind of doing a consultation for him, and I sold him the name. And so he was there a year, and they bought him out because they were selling the building or something, you know. So that lasted about a year. And then I got a call from a friend who knew the principals who were putting together the Jedediah Hawkins Inn in 2006.
So talk to me about Jedediah. That was supposed to be a haunted house. What was the...
Yeah, it was an old... The kids call it a haunted house. It was just a house that was in terrible disrepair for years and years. And Jeff Halleck, who's a builder out there, saw it and decided he wanted to restore it and raised the money and did. And so when I came on the scene, the house had already been shown as a show house and all of that.
And it was more of a bed and breakfast?
Well, it was nothing when we got
No, but when Jeff took it over.
No, when Jeff took it over, it was just a redo of a house into a... It had a home kitchen, and they used it as a show house to raise funds for the town or whatever. So when I came on board, they were talking about doing a B&B, and they recruited me to open it, which I did, and I was there for about 2 years, and was supposed to become a partner, but there was an issue with one of the partners, and I didn't want to go into it, but it was one of those things that we just couldn't work out, so I wound up leaving there.
So when did you get involved with the entertainment business, as we would say? Because you were on television, and then how long have you been on radio now?
6 years.
So tell me about your radio show.
The radio show started with the Jim and Kim show on, I don't remember the call letters. But anyway, it was a Long Island radio station. They were the morning talent. And around the holidays, they would bring me on to do recipes or something, you know, and I had just written the book at the time. And we started talking about some of the stories in the book. And so I became like a regular guest on the show. And then one of the producers, Stu, took me aside and he says, you know, you're pretty good at this. Why don't would you consider doing a show, you know? So I said, well, I don't know anything about radio, you know. So I said, you know, I like the challenge. Yeah, that'd be fun, you know. And you know, you never get tired of talking about food and wine. And the next year it happens all over again because tomatoes come back in season. So you never run out of material, you know. So that's how it started. And we started with an interview of a musician friend of mine who's also a beekeeper. You know, so we do things like that. We interview chefs and winemakers and growers and farmers and mushroom foragers and restaurant owners.
And you're on every Saturday morning from 10 to 11,
10 to 11, right? Yeah.
On what station?
WHLI, AM, 1100, and WALK, I think it's 1370.
So you have a large area.
Yeah, the whole island, actually.
The whole island on that situation. So let's talk about the book, because the book came out as stories about people, right?
Yes. What happened was I had read an article about a restaurant customer's Bill of Rights, and it was 10 rights that the customer is entitled to, i.e., you know, clean surroundings, a cheerful hello, food served at the right temperature, glasses without lipstick or whatever. And I looked at that and I said, you know, there's another side to this. There's, you know, there should be a restaurant owner's, you know, 10, you know, how about a cheerful hello back? How about showing up for a reservation when you make it, you know, and all that. So I kind of wrote a little thing about that, and it got picked up by this magazine, The Great Restaurants of Long Island. And so I started talking to him about things that I had seen, and he goes, really? The customers behave like that? I said, yeah, all the time. So he says, could you write about that? I said, yeah, you know, sure. So I wrote a top 10 article, my top 10 worst customers of the year. And the article caught on, and it went viral with the magazine, and so there was a clamor for me to do it again. And I wound up doing 1 or 2 years, and then...
How many of them would you write each year?
Just one a year.
1 a year.
Of 10 people. And then I think the third year I was in the middle of writing that, and I decided to do a cookbook. And as I was assembling all the recipes, you know, I was going to do a cookbook of Long Island foods, whatever. A friend of mine who happens to be a writer, Nelson DeMille, who wrote the foreword to my book, actually, said, you know, I called him up and I said, you know, listen, I need some advice. He goes, please don't tell me you're going to write a book. I said, yeah, I'm thinking about it. He goes, do yourself a favor. Take 2 aspirins and lay in a warm, dark place until the feeling passes. You don't want to do this, you know. So I said, no, I really want to do this cookbook thing. He says, why would you do that? There's a million crab cake recipes out there. He says, you know, if you're going to do this, why don't you go along the lines of that article that you do? Because it's really funny, you know. So I said, do you think so? He says, yeah, no, really. He says, I'm telling you, it's what you should do that, you know. So that's what happened. That's how it started, you know.
So did you get an agent or how?
No, well, Nelson gave me his agent, you know, and I got turned down. So I called him back up. I said, hey, Mr. Big Shot Writer, you're supposed to be, I mean, really, you know, I can get turned down on my own. I need you to get signed. You know, we were laughing about it. So it turns out that I decided to self-publish for two reasons. One is you make more money per book. And two is I thought I had enough juice on Long Island to be able to sell some books. You know, if you don't,
I assume you have it at the restaurants.
I have it at the restaurants, I have the wineries, and ultimately we sold about 8,000 copies, 9,000, something like that, which is, you know, fairly good. And, you know, I just contracted to do a second one with the same producer, so I may self-publish the second one also.
And what's the second one going to be? Similar?
You
mean more bad customers?
Oh, there's no shortage of talent, Mike. There's no shortage of talent. So I think I'm going to do one more of those because there's a little bit of a clamor for it, and then I think I'll just put that
what
horse
do
away.
what are the stories about? What's your
Literally
favorite?
hundreds.
What's your favorite one?
One of my favorites is I was in the back of Jewel in one of the back rooms, and I was tasting some Burgundies that one of the wine salesmen brought over. And my daughter came in; she was managing at the time, and she goes, "Did you tell Mrs. Smith she could bring a cake in?" It was the middle of lunch. So I said, "No, why?" She said, "Well, she's got a cake. It's about 4 feet by 2 feet, and she's dragging it in the restaurant." So I said, "Well, let her know that there's like a cake cutting fee for that, you know." So she comes back about 10 minutes later. She goes, she's not really wild about the cake cutting fee, you know. She says she'll cut the cake herself. I said, well, explain to her that it's not the cutting, it's the dishes, the detergent, the electricity, the salary, yada, 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 So she comes back, she doesn't need dishes and they'll use their own forks. So sometimes I think the best revenge is to give people exactly what they want because they don't really know what they're doing. And so I said, all right, fine, no forks, whatever, just let her do the cake. So I come walking out, and there's 15 women standing around this occasion cake, digging them with no plates, just eating it with forks, 15 of them around. It looks like ants at a picnic, And as I walk by, the woman goes to me, this is ridiculous. And I'm like, I couldn't agree more. You're the architect. All you had to do was pay the cake fee.
How'd you get into the wine business?
Well, that was kind of like a vanity project. I wanted to do a proprietary wine that I would pour in one of the restaurants. So it was Coolfish at the time. The year was 2000. It was 2000. I approached Charles Massoud from Pomanac, who I had a relationship with, and I said, I'd like to make a wine that I could pour in the restaurant. I'd like to do a Riesling. And he was gracious enough to let me do it. And it turned out that it was A, such fun, and B, it worked out, financially and stuff, and the people liked the wine, and it was called Coolfish Riesling at the time. I decided to make another one, so I made a Chardonnay, and then Chardonnay grew into a blend, and then the blend grew into a red, and so now I make about 8 or 10 different
And you
wines.
make, as you said, about 300 cases a year.
About 300, yeah.
So let's talk about what the restaurants you have today. And
today I have Jewel, which is in Melville, big, brassy, brasserie type of restaurant. I have Beiju, which is a sashimi and sake bar, which is in the same building in Melville. And then I have Allure, which is on the water in Port of Egypt Marina in Southold, seafood-centric restaurant. I have Amano in Mattatuck on Main Road, which is kind of like a country-style Tuscan restaurant. We have a wood-burning pizza oven, and it's Italian food like you'd find in Italy, not Little Italy.
And the last but not least.
And the last but not least, with my daughter, I have a place called the Petulant Wino, which she says is autobiographical. And that's like a little tapas tasting, wine-centric restaurant.
Her name?
Her name is Courtney.
And then Courtney gave you a little granddaughter a couple months ago.
She gave me a little granddaughter, Harley. Now I have 2 Harleys. I have one I can ride and one I can spoil.
So for the kid who really screwed up his amplifiers and, forged his working papers, it's a good thing, and you've done really well, and I'm happy that you were my guest today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you.